Jonathan Whitaker's fist came down on the table so hard the crystal jumped, and still not one honest word crossed it. His most important knight was dying in front of him, Spanish merchants, shouting a native chief, rising to leave a frontier war crawling toward his door. And the only soul who could stop it sat silent at the far end, the wife every man had told him to ignore. If you want to see how far one quiet woman's voice can travel, subscribe now and stay with this story to the very last word. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? The trouble started with a word Silas Boone did not translate, and Jonathan Whitaker would spend the rest of his life wondering how a man could ruin so much with so little. They had come to his house because his house meant something. That was the point of a house like Whitaker's 12 rooms of Virginia oak and imported glass standing above the James River like a promise a man could keep. Colonel Matthew Hale had said as much in his letter. Neutral ground, he'd written. Somewhere the Spaniard will feel respected, and the chief will feel safe, and the frontier men will feel their money is protected. You have all three, Whitaker. God help us, you might be the only man in the state who does. So Jonathan had opened his doors. He had the long table set with the good service. The candles lit down its length, the wine decanted and breathing. He had shaken every hand as it came through the door. Colonel Hale's dry and firm. Don Rafael Castillo's gloved and cool. The old French trader Beaumont's ink-stained and quick. And last of all, the hand of Chief Gray Elk, who had not offered it until Jonathan offered his own, and who had held Jonathan's gaze a beat longer than any white man in that room would have found comfortable. You keep a fine house, the chief had said through Boone. I keep an honest one, Jonathan answered. Gray Elk had only nodded at that, as if honesty were a thing he'd learned to wait and see about. Now they were an hour into the meal, and the honesty was gone, and Jonathan didn't even know when it had left. Tell him again. Don Rafael was saying, his fork pointed like a small blade at Boone. Tell him the terms have not changed. The harbor rights, the timber, the crossing at the ford, none of it has changed. He agreed to these terms in the spring. Boone dabbed his mouth. He was a soft-fleshed man with pale eyes that never quite settled, and he took his time before he turned to the chief and spoke in a low run of syllables that Jonathan could not follow. Gray Elk's face changed. Not much. A tightening at the jaw, a slow lowering of the chin. But Jonathan had spent 3 months learning to read a face that gave nothing away, and he knew a closing door when he saw one. The chief answered, short, flat. Boone turned back. He says the terms have changed a great deal. He says your people always say the words have not changed, and then the fences move in the night. That is not, Don Rafael set his fork down. That is not what we agreed. Tell him I am a merchant, not a fence builder. Tell him the Spanish have no interest in his forests, only in the harbor. Boone opened his mouth. Jonathan watched him choose his words the way a card player chooses which card to burn. Boone, Jonathan said. The interpreter looked up. Say it plain. Whatever the chief said, say it plain to Don Rafael, and whatever the Don says, say it plain to the chief. I'll have no ornament on it tonight. Of course, Mr. Whitaker. Boone smiled, and the smile did not reach his settling eyes. I speak only what is said. He did not. Jonathan couldn't have proved it. That was the horror of the thing, sitting at your own table watching your own ruin, and having no more evidence of it than a feeling in your gut. But he'd built a shipping fortune out of feelings in his gut, and every one of them was standing up now, telling him this man was lying in 4 directions at once. Colonel Hale leaned toward him. The colonel was a lean man, gray at the temples, and he had the look of someone who'd sat through 100 rooms like this and watched half of them go bad. It's slipping, he murmured. I've seen it slip before. You feel it slip, and there's not a thing you can grab. Then grab the interpreter, Jonathan said. He's the only one who speaks all 3 tongues within 100 miles. Hale's mouth was grim. That's the trouble with a man like Boone. He knows he's the only rope across the river, so he charges what he likes for the crossing. Down the table, Beaumont the Frenchman was trying to soothe the Spaniard in a mix of French and broken Castilian, and the Spaniard was not soothed, and Gray Elk had gone very still, and stillness in Gray Elk was worse than shouting in any other man. Jonathan looked at the wreckage of his table and felt the whole night tilting toward the cliff. And at the far end, past the candles, past the arguing men, sat his wife, Eliza Monroe Whitaker, 24 years old, married to him 91 days. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes down on the cloth, and she had not spoken a full sentence to him since the morning they were wed. He had, if he was honest, and tonight he was trying to be nearly forgotten she was in the room. That was the shameful truth of it. He'd married her because her family's name had once meant something, and his money meant something now, and the arrangement had suited both fathers, and he had brought her into his fine house and set her at the far end of his fine table, and thought of her. When he thought of her at all, as one more decent thing a man of standing was expected to own. A quiet wife. An ordinary wife. Plain, obedient, uneducated, that was what the Monroes had sold, and what he'd believed he'd bought. 3 months, and he'd never once asked her a single question that couldn't be answered with yes or no. Whitaker. Colonel Hale's voice pulled him back. The chief is standing. Gray Elk was standing. He rose without haste the way a mountain might decide to rise, and every man at the table stopped talking at once. Boone half came out of his chair. Don Raphael's gloved hand flattened on the cloth. Beaumont's mouth hung open on a word he'd never finish. He is leaving, Boone said quickly. He says there is no more to say. He says your people speak with 2 mouths, and he will take his people home, and there will be no agreement, and... Boone's voice climbed. And he says what happens at the ford after that is on your heads, not his. He said all that just now. Jonathan was on his feet. In 4 words, it is a complicated tongue, Mr. Whitaker. Chief? Jonathan came around the table with his hand out the way you'd approach a horse gone wall-eyed. Chief Gray Elk, sit, please. Whatever's been said, we can unsay it. Colonel, tell him. But the colonel had no tongue to tell him with, and Boone was the only bridge, and the bridge was on fire. Gray Elk looked at Jonathan's outstretched hand. He did not take it. He reached instead for the cloak folded over the back of his chair, and there was a finality in the gesture that made Jonathan's stomach drop, because he knew the way. You know a ship has struck before you feel the shudder, that when this man walked out that door, men would die at the crossing before the summer was through. Frontier families. Native families. The whole delicate thing Hale had spent a year stitching together torn open in one dinner at Jonathan Whitaker's own table under Jonathan Whitaker's own honest roof. And then from the far end of the table, a glass was set down. It was a small sound, a single soft click of crystal on wood. But it landed in the silence like a stone in a still pond, and every head turned toward it. Eliza Whitaker had unfolded her hands. She was looking at the chief. Not down at the cloth, up at Gray Elk full in the face in a way no one had seen her look at anything in 3 months. And when she opened her mouth, what came out was not English. It was a long, low-cadenced run of words in Gray Elk's own tongue, clean unhurried, the vowels shaped like a person who had grown them in her mouth for years. The room froze. Boone's soft face went the color of tallow. Gray Elk turned, slowly, the cloak still in his hand, and the mountain of a man stared down the length of the candlelit table at the silent wife. Nobody had counted, and something crossed his face that had not been there all night. Surprise, and behind the surprise, the first faint light of something that might have been hope. He answered her. Quiet. A question. Eliza answered the question. And Jonathan Whitaker stood frozen in the middle of his own dining room, with his hand still stupidly extended toward empty air, and heard his wife, his plain, ordinary, uneducated wife, speaking a language he had not known existed inside her, and understood in the space of a single heartbeat that he had married a woman he had never once bothered to meet. Eliza. Her name came out of him cracked. Eliza, what are you? Be quiet, Jonathan. She did not raise her voice. She did not even look at him. But the words hit him like a slap, because they were the first thing she had ever asked of him, and what she had asked was for his silence. Please, I need to hear him. Gray Elk spoke again, longer this time, and Jonathan watched his wife listen. She listened the way he imagined a physician listened to a chest, leaning slightly, and all of her gathered to the sound, her eyes moving, as if she were reading the words off the air. When the chief finished, she was quiet a moment, arranging something behind her eyes, Then she turned to Boone. "Mr. Boone," she said, and now her voice was in plain English, and it was low and even, and it carried the whole length of the table without ever seeming to rise. "The chief has just told me what he believes he has agreed to tonight, and it is nothing at all like what you have been telling this room he agreed to." Boone's tongue came out and wet his lips. "Mrs. Whitaker, with respect, the chief's dialect is a difficult. It is the Wampanoag trade dialect crossed with the Northern River cant," Eliza said. "It is difficult if you have learned it from a book. Where did you learn it?" "Mr. Boone." The room had gone so quiet, Jonathan could hear the candles. Boone looked to Hale, to Don Raphael, to Jonathan, for someone to save him, and found no one. "I have worked the frontier 15 years, madam. I hardly think a young lady who has spent her life in a parlor." "Then correct me." Eliza folded her hands again, but it was a different folding now, not the meekness of a woman waiting to be excused, but the composure of a woman who has decided to stay. "You have twice now translated the chief's word for boundary as the word for wall. They are not the same word. One means a line both peoples agree to walk up to. The other means a thing one people builds to keep the other out. The chief has spent the whole of this dinner offering Colonel Hale a line to walk up to, and you, sir, have spent the whole of this dinner telling Colonel Hale the chief wants to build a wall." Colonel Hale's chair scraped. "Say that again." "There is no wall, Colonel." Eliza's eyes went to Hale, and stayed steady on him, and did not waver. "There was never any wall. The chief has not once threatened this table. He has been trying all night in the plainest terms his tongue allows to agree with you. And Mr. Boone has been translating his agreement as a threat." "That's a lie." Boone was on his feet now. "That is a slander against my—" "Sit down, Boone." Hale did not shout it. He never shouted. But there was iron in it. The iron of a man who has just felt the floor of his understanding drop away and grabbed for the first solid thing. "Mrs. Whitaker, you'll forgive me. I have staked 1 year of my life and a good many other lives on the terms discussed at this table tonight. If what you say is true, then I have spent that year being lied to in my own language by a man I paid to tell me the truth. So I have to ask you, and I have to ask you plainly." He turned to face her fully. "How in God's name does a lady of Virginia come to speak the Wampanoag trade cant?" And Jonathan, standing forgotten between them, his heart going like a hammer, realized he wanted the answer to that question more than he had wanted anything in a long, long time. Eliza was quiet for a moment. "That," she said at last, "is a longer story than this night has room for, Colonel. And it will keep. The chief will not." She turned back to Gray Elk. And here she did something that made the breath catch in Jonathan's throat. She rose from her chair. His wife, who had sat like a well-behaved shadow at the foot of his table for 3 months, stood up in a room full of powerful men, and none of them told her to sit, because none of them dared. She spoke to the chief again in his own tongue. Gray Elk listened, and when she finished, the great stone face of him did something no one at that table had seen it do all night. It softened. He set his cloak back down over the chair. "Colonel Hale," Eliza said, still standing, her eyes moving now between the chief and the Spaniard and the soldier as if she were holding 3 separate threads and had at last found the loom to weave them on. "The chief will stay. He has agreed to hear the terms once more, but he will hear them from me in his tongue, and he asks, and I think it is a fair thing to ask, that no word passes between this table and his people tonight that does not pass through a mouth he can trust." She paused. "He does not trust Mr. Boone." "No," said Colonel Hale, slowly looking at Boone with a new and terrible attention. "No, I don't believe I do either." "Then it is settled," Eliza said. "Sit, gentlemen, please. The wine's gone warm, and the chief's people are waiting on the lawn, and there is a great deal of misunderstanding to unpick, and not much night left to do it in." She glanced for the first time at her husband. "Jonathan, perhaps you might have the coffee brought. It's going to be a long evening." Jonathan Whitaker looked at his wife. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Somewhere in the last 5 minutes, the entire architecture of what he believed about the woman he had married had come down like a house in a flood, and he was standing in the ruin of it, and he did not have a single word. "The coffee, Jonathan," Eliza said gently. Yes, he managed. Yes, of course. The coffee. He went to the door and gave the order to the servant standing white-faced in the hall, and when he turned back to the room, his wife had already sat back down, but she had moved. She had taken up a place beside the chief in a chair that a servant had drawn for her without her asking, and she was leaning toward Grey Elk, and Grey Elk was leaning toward her, and the two of them were speaking in low, even tones, and for the first time all night, the table was not tilting toward the cliff. Don Rafael Castillo watched her over his folded gloves with an expression Jonathan couldn't read. Beaumont the Frenchman had a small, strange smile. And Silas Boone had sat back down, but he had not touched his coffee when it came, and his settling eyes had gone from face to face around that table. And Jonathan, who knew a cornered thing when he saw one, thought, he's not beaten. A beaten man doesn't look like that. A beaten man looks at the floor. Boone's looking at the doors. But that was a worry for later. For now, Jonathan pulled out his own chair and sat down heavily, and watched his wife do the impossible. She unpicked it, thread by thread. She would listen to Grey Elk and turn to Hale and give the colonel the chief's words in an English so clean and careful that Hale kept stopping to say, "Wait, wait." He said that, and each time the answer was yes. "Colonel, that is what he said. That is what he has been saying all along." She would catch a stumble from Don Rafael, and before it could harden into an insult, turn it soft and set it down in Spanish so smooth the Don's eyebrows climbed his forehead. Once when Beaumont muttered something under his breath in French about the whole business being cursed from the start, Eliza answered him in French without even looking up, and the old traitor laughed out loud. The first laugh the room had heard all night, and slapped the table and said in English, "Mon Dieu, Whitaker, where have you been keeping her? Where have you been keeping her?" The words went into Jonathan like a splinter. Where had he been keeping her at the foot of his table? In the smallest of the good bedrooms, because he'd not thought to give her a better one. In the corner of his life, reserved for things that were his, and did not matter. 3 months. She had sat 3 months in his house holding all of this inside her, every tongue at this table, and God knew how many more, and he had never once asked her a question worth the asking, and if this night had gone the way it was meant to go, she'd have sat silent at the foot of his table while his whole enterprise burned, and she'd have let it burn, because no one had ever given her the smallest reason to believe her voice was wanted in his house. He watched her save him. And the more she saved him, the smaller he felt, and the smaller he felt, the more he understood that this smallness was the beginning of something, though he could not yet have said what. Mrs. Whitaker. Colonel Hale had a paper out now, and a pencil, and he was writing fast. "The crossing at the ford. If I've followed you, the chief doesn't object to the crossing. He objects to who decides when a wagon may cross." "Just so," said Eliza. In Mr. Boone's telling, the chief demanded a toll and a guard, and the right to turn wagons back. In truth. She turned to Grey. Elk said a few words, listened, turned back. In truth, he asks only that when there is a dispute at the ford, it be settled by a man from each people together, not by soldiers, not by traders. One of his, one of yours, standing in the water working it out. He says, here she paused and something moved across her face, some private feeling she folded down before it could show. He says that is how his father settled things, and his father's father, and that the river has never yet drowned a man who came to it, willing to stand in it beside his enemy. The table was quiet. "Write that down, Colonel," Don Rafael said softly. "Word for word if the lady will give it you again. I have negotiated with kings who could not put a thing so well." "I intend to," said Hale. His pencil had stopped. He was looking at Eliza with the plain, open astonishment of a man watching a thing he'd been told was impossible. "Mrs. Whitaker, I'll say this once, and then I'll not embarrass you further. I have been 30 years in the service of settling quarrels between peoples who don't share a word. I have watched interpreters start wars out of laziness and end them out of luck. And I have never, not once, not in 30 years, sat at a table with a mind like the one across from me now. Wherever you learned this, however you learned it, whatever it cost you." He set the pencil down. It was the best spent education in this Commonwealth, and any man who told you otherwise was a fool. Jonathan felt those words land on him because he was the man who had told her otherwise. Not in words. He'd never bothered with words. He'd told her with the foot of the table and the small bedroom and the 3 months of yes or no. He'd told her every day since she came under his roof without once opening his mouth that she was ordinary. Eliza did not answer Hale. She looked down at her folded hands, and Jonathan saw, because he was watching her now, the way he should have watched her from the first day, hungrily, ashamedly trying to read a book he'd left closed on a shelf for 3 months. He saw a flush climb her throat. Not pleasure. Something more complicated than pleasure. As if a kind word offered plainly were a thing she did not quite know how to hold, because she had gone so long without one that her hands had forgotten the shape. And into that quiet, that soft, unguarded human quiet, Silas Boone spoke. "It's a remarkable performance," Boone said. "Truly, I don't dispute the lady is clever." He turned his settling eyes around the table, gathering the men, leaving the woman out of it the way a man cuts one animal from a herd. "But I would remind the gentlemen present of what they know, and this young woman in her enthusiasm seems to have forgotten. That these are men's affairs. That there are agreements here that will bind this commonwealth for a generation, and that they are being rewritten at this hour, on the word of one lady, one with no witness to her learning, no account of where she came by it, and no man at this table able to check a syllable she says against the truth. You are all," Boone spread his soft hands, "taking her entirely on faith. And I have known a great many charming persons in my life to be believed entirely on faith, right up until the moment the faith proved costly. It was well done. Jonathan had to grant the devil that. It was very well done, because there was not a man at that table who could gainsay it. Not one of them could check her. That was the plain truth. She was the only bridge now, just as Boone had been the only bridge before, and Boone had reached past all her learning and put his soft hand right on the oldest lever in the room. She's a woman. What is she doing speaking in men's affairs? Who does she think she is? And Jonathan watched it work. He watched it happen in his wife's face in the space of 2 breaths. He watched her come down off whatever high clear place she had climbed to. He watched the flush that Hale's kindness had raised turn into the older, deeper flush of a woman who has just been reminded publicly of her place. Her shoulders, which had been up square alive, came down. Her chin came down. Her eyes went back to the cloth. And her folded hands, which a moment ago had been the folded hands of a woman gathering herself to speak, became again the folded hands of a woman preparing herself to disappear. "Perhaps," Eliza said very low to the tablecloth, "perhaps Mr. Boone is right. Perhaps I've overstepped. Colonel, if you'd rather I—" "No," said Jonathan. He had not planned to speak. The word came up out of him from somewhere below the place where planning happened, and it came out loud enough that it stopped her, and it stopped the whole table, and it stopped Boone with his soft hands still spread in the candlelight. Every face turned to him. Jonathan Whittaker stood at the head of his table and looked down the length of it, past the ruined dinner, past the Spaniard and the soldier and the Frenchman and the chief, past the corrupt little man with the settling eyes to the woman at the far end, who had just on his account begun to fold herself back into silence. And he understood that whatever he said next was the most important thing he had ever said in his life, and that he had exactly one chance to say it right, and that 3 months of not asking her a single question had earned him no right at all to be believed. "Mr. Boone," he said, and his voice was not loud now. It was worse than loud. It was quiet and level, and every man in that room leaned toward it. "You said something a moment ago I'd like to hold up to the light. You said no man at this table can check what my wife says against the truth, that we take her on faith." "I did." Boone's chin lifted. "And I stand by it." "So do I," Jonathan said. "That's the trouble, isn't it? We've none of us got the tongues to check her." He came a step down the table, and another. "But here's a thing I can check Boone without a word of any language but my own. I've sat at this table an hour and watched this whole agreement die by inches, and I want every man here to think back plain and honest on how it was dying." Another step. "Every time it lurched toward the cliff, every single time whose word was it lurched on? The silence changed. Jonathan could feel it change. "Colonel," Jonathan said, not taking his eyes off Boone. "This last hour, every threat you heard from the chief's side of the table, every insult, every wall he was supposedly building, every toll he was supposedly demanding, every ugly thing that made your good year of work start to come apart in your hands." He took the last step so that he was standing over Boone's chair, now looking down. "Whose mouth did all of it come out of?" Colonel Hale did not answer right away. He was a careful man. But Jonathan saw him do. The arithmetic saw him go back over the whole poisoned evening and total it up, and saw the moment the total came out, because the color went out of Hale's face. "His," Hale said. "God forgive me, every word of it. It all came through Boone." "Every word," Jonathan agreed. "And every one of those words was pushing this table apart. And then a woman opens her mouth for the first time all night, a woman with no stake in it, no fee to collect, nothing to gain by lying to any of us, and every word she speaks pushes this table back together. Now." He put both hands on the back of Boone's chair and leaned down so his face was close to the interpreter's. "I'm a shipping man, Boone. I'm no scholar. I can't tell you the word for wall in the chief's tongue. But I have spent 20 years reading which way a thing is moving and betting my fortune on it, and I have never in my life seen a clearer current than the one running through this room tonight. Every word out of you tore something. Every word out of her mends it. I don't need your 7 languages to read that, sir. I can read it in plain Virginia English, and so can every honest man at this table." Boone's mouth worked. "You would take the word of a woman over. I would take the word of the person in this room who's the only one trying to save it," Jonathan said, "over the word of the person who's been quietly setting it on fire. Yes, every day of the week and twice on Sunday." And then he straightened and turned from Boone as if the man were furniture, and walked the whole length of his own table past every astonished face, down to the far end where his wife sat with her chin lowered and her hands folded and her eyes on the cloth. And he stopped beside her chair, and the whole room watched him do it. "Eliza." He said her name low, but he did not care anymore who heard it. "I owe you an apology I don't have the words for, and I'm not going to try to make it now in front of company, because you deserve better than that, and God knows you've waited long enough for it. But I'll say one thing now, and I'll say it out loud, so every man here hears it, because every man here just heard Boone try to shame you into silence, and I'll not have the last word on my wife in my own house belong to a liar." He drew a breath. "You are the finest mind at this table. You have been the finest mind at this table since the moment you sat down, and I was too great a fool to see it, and I have been too great a fool to see it for 3 months. I don't ask you to forgive that tonight. I only ask you," and here for the first time in 91 days, Jonathan Whittaker asked his wife a question that could not be answered with yes or no. "I only ask you to finish what you started, not for me. I've forfeited any right to ask you a thing for me. For them." He nodded down the table at Hale, at the chief, at all the fragile human weight of it. "Will you finish it?" Eliza Whittaker lifted her head. She looked up at her husband. Really looked the way she had looked at Gray Elk, full in the face. And Jonathan felt that look go all the way through him, because there was so much in it. There was surprise, and there was a wariness that told him plainer than any speech how little kindness she'd learned to expect from him. But underneath the wariness so faint, he might have imagined it if he hadn't been staring so hard, there was something else beginning. Something that had not been there when she'd come to his house. Something that had perhaps been waiting 3 months for one single soul to ask. "You said my wife," she said quietly. Only he could hear it. "Just now, to Mr. Boone. You said the last word on my wife." "I did." "You've not called me that before, not once, not in 3 months." It was not an accusation. It was worse than an accusation. It was said the way a person reports a fact they have long since stopped hoping to change. "I wasn't sure you knew it was the word." Jonathan Whittaker had been called hard in his life, and proud and cold, and every one of those things had been true, and none of them had ever touched him. This touched him. This nearly took his knees. "I know it's the word," he said. "I'm 3 months late in meaning it, but I know it's the word." For a long moment, his wife said nothing at all. Then she unfolded her hands. And she rose from her chair a second time. And this time her husband drew it back for her, and this time when she stood, the whole room was already looking at her. Waiting, and there was not a man among them. Not Hale, not the Don, not the Frenchman, not the chief. And least of all, the pale, sweating creature at the far end with his untouched coffee going cold. There was not one man in that candlelit room who would have dared to tell her to sit back down. "Colonel Hale," Eliza said, and her voice had climbed back up to where it had been level and clear and carrying. "You had your pencil. Take it up again. We'll start from the crossing at the ford, and we'll go slow, and we'll do it right, and I'll not let a word pass this table tonight that I can't stand behind in the morning." She turned to the chief and spoke a few soft syllables, and Gray Elk inclined his great head, and something passed between the two of them that no interpreter had put there. Then she turned back to the room, and to her husband, and she said the thing that Jonathan Whittaker would carry with him to the end of his days. The thing that turned that ruined night onto its hinge and swung it open toward everything that came after. "Now, let's find out what these men have actually been trying to say to each other all this time. Because I've been listening since the soup gentleman. I've been listening for 3 months to be truthful, and I promise you, not one of you has yet heard the half of it." And down at the far end of the table in the shadow past the candles, Silas Boone reached very quietly for his coat. Silas Boone reached for his coat, and Colonel Matthew Hale, who had spent 30 years watching men make their small betraying movements at tables like this one, saw it. "Sit down, Mr. Boone." Boone's hand froze on the collar of his coat. "The hour is late, Colonel. I've a room at the tavern in—" "You've a chair right there," Hale said, "and you'll keep it warm a while longer. A man who's translated a year of my life doesn't leave the moment a lady starts checking his figures. It looks poorly. Sit." Boone sat. But he did not let go of the coat, and Jonathan Whittaker, watching from beside his wife's chair, thought he's keeping one hand on the door. He filed it away. "Now." Hale took up his pencil and turned the whole force of his attention to Eliza, the way a man turns a lamp. "Mrs. Whittaker, the crossing at the ford. You said the chief asks that disputes be settled by one man from each people standing in the water together. I've written that. What I want next is the thing Boone told me 3 weeks ago that I've built half my treaty on. He told me the chief demanded the ford be closed to wagons between the first frost and the spring thaw, half a year. I've been fighting that clause with the frontier families for a month. They say it strangles their trade. Ask the chief if it's true." Eliza turned to Gray Elk and spoke. It was not a short speech. Jonathan watched the chief's face through it, watched the flat, guarded stone of him crack and shift as the words went in. And at the end of it, Gray Elk did something Jonathan had not seen him do all night. He made a low sound in his chest that was almost a laugh and shook his head slowly side to side. "He says no," Eliza reported. "He says he never asked for the ford to be closed. Not for a day. Not for an hour." She paused. "He says he asked that the ford not be crossed by armed men after dark, because his people camp on the far bank in the cold months, and a wagon of armed strangers coming through their sleeping children at midnight is how massacres begin. That is the whole of it, Colonel. No wagons after dark in winter if they carry guns. Trade may cross at noon every day of the year, and welcome." The pencil stopped. Hale sat very still. Then he set the pencil down flat with great care, as a man sets down something he no longer trusts his hand to hold. "Say that to me once more. No armed men after dark in winter, that is all he asked. For a month." Hale's voice had gone strange. "For a month, I have sat across a table from the men of the Blue Ridge settlements and told them the chief demanded the ford closed half the year. I have watched their faces harden. I have watched 2 of them good men decide that if that was the price of peace, then peace wasn't worth it, and go home to clean their rifles. I nearly lost the whole eastern half of this agreement over a clause the chief never spoke." He turned his head slowly down the table. "Mr. Boone, Colonel, Where did the closed ford come from, Mr. Boone? The half year. The strangling of trade. Where did I get it if not from the chief's mouth through yours? Interpretation is an art, Colonel, not a—" "It is not an art." Hale did not raise his voice, and that was the terrible part. Jonathan saw grown men flinch from the quiet of it. It is a trust, and I begin to think you've been selling my trust by the yard to whoever would pay the freight. So I'll ask you a plain question, and I'll have a plain answer. Who profits from a ford closed half the year? Not the chief, not the settlers. Who? Boone said nothing, and into that silence quietly from beside her husband's hand, Eliza spoke, not to Boone, not to Hale, but almost to herself, the way a person says the answer to a riddle the moment before the room says it too. The man who owns the other ford. Every head turned to her. There is a second crossing, Eliza said. 9 miles north, on patented land, a private ford with a private toll. I heard 2 of Mr. Boone's men speak of it on the lawn this evening before dinner, when they thought no lady understood the frontier cant they were speaking. They were pleased. They said, she hesitated, and Jonathan saw her decide to say it plainly. They said that once the free crossing was shut for the winter, every wagon in the valley would have to pay the northern toll or turn back. They laughed about it. They said the interpreter had done his part, and the rest was easy. The silence in the room was total. That's a lie, Boone said, but his voice had gone up half a register, and every ear in the room heard it climb. That is a wicked scheming lie from a woman who owns the northern ford, Mr. Boone? Hale asked. I don't see who owns it? I own a share in it, Boone said. As do a dozen respectable men. There's no crime in. There it is? Don Rafael Castillo, who had been silent so long Jonathan had half forgotten him, set down his glove with a soft slap on the cloth. He had been watching all of it with the flat, patient eyes of a man who has been cheated in 6 countries and knows the shape of it in the dark. There is your closed ford, Colonel. There is your half-year. He was not translating a treaty. He was building himself a toll road and using all our mouths to pour the foundation. He turned those flat eyes on Boone with something like professional appreciation. It is a good scheme, senor. I have run worse. But you have been caught by a woman who was listening to your men on the lawn, and that is the one risk a man in our trade can never insure against. That somewhere in the room there is a person everyone has agreed not to see. You believe her? Boone's composure was going now, coming apart at the seams in front of them. All of you'll take the word of a woman nobody in this Commonwealth has ever heard speak a sentence over 15 years of my yes, said 4 voices. They did not plan it. It simply happened. Hale and Don Raphael and Beaumont and half a beat behind them, low and certain Jonathan Whitaker. The word landed on Boone from 4 directions at once, and Jonathan watched something go out of the man, some last bet he'd been holding. But it did not go out entirely. Jonathan, who had spent the evening learning to read this man, saw the settling eyes drop for the first time, not in defeat, but in calculation. He's not folding, Jonathan thought again. He's counting his money. He's deciding what he's got left to spend. Well? Boone smoothed his coat across his knee. His voice had changed. The bluster was gone, and in its place was something oilier and worse. The voice of a man who has decided that if he cannot win with the truth, he will make the truth expensive. Since we are all being so plain tonight, since Mrs. Whitaker has favored us with such a full accounting of everyone else's business, perhaps the lady would favor us with a little accounting of her own. Jonathan felt his wife go still beside him. That's enough, Boone, he said. Is it? I don't think it is, Mr. Whitaker, and here's why. Boone spread his soft hands, and the composure came back into his face, that awful gathering composure. And Jonathan understood with a cold drop in his gut that they had all been so busy watching the man drown that they'd forgotten a drowning man will grab whatever's nearest and pull it under with him. Colonel Hale asked not 10 minutes past a question that this whole table found so charming it forgot to press for the answer. He asked how a lady of Virginia comes to speak the Wampanoag cant, and the Spanish, and the French, and the Latin, if half of what I've heard is true. He asked, and the lady said it was a longer story than the night had room for, and we all found that so gracious we let it lie. Boone leaned forward. But I've spent 15 years on the frontier, Colonel, and I'll tell you a thing I know for a fact. There are only so many ways a white woman comes to speak the trade cant of four peoples, and not one of them is the kind of story a respectable family tells at church. The room had gone cold. "You will stop talking," Jonathan said, "or I will stop you. You wanted the truth, Mr. Whitaker. You made a fine speech about it. You said you'd take the word of the honest one in the room." Boone smiled. "So let's have all the truth. Let's have the lady tell this table where she learned 4 tongues. Let's have her tell us who she lived among, and for how long, and in what condition, that a young girl of a poor family came out of it, speaking the languages of every man on the frontier a respectable family teaches its daughters to fear." He sat back. "Or is the truth only for interpreters tonight, not for wives?" Jonathan started forward. He did not know what he meant to do. Put the man out the door, put him through it. He only knew his hands had made themselves into a thing he'd have to answer for. And a hand came down on his sleeve. Eliza's. "Jonathan? Quiet. Don't. He has no right." "He has no right," she agreed. "But he has a question. And it is not God help me an unfair one." She rose. He had not expected that. He'd expected her to fold again the way she'd folded when Boone had shamed her the first time. And the fact that she did not fold, that she stood instead straight and pale and steady, hit Jonathan harder than any folding could have. "You've all been very kind to me tonight," she said to the table. "Kinder than I'm accustomed to. And Mr. Boone is right that I owe you an accounting because you're about to sign your names to terms you heard from my mouth, and a man has a right to know whose mouth he's trusting. So I'll tell you. Not because he's earned it, because you have. Eliza, you don't." "I do, Jonathan. Sit down, please." And he sat, because there was something in her voice. He'd never heard a thing that had been buried 3 months in the small bedroom at the foot of his life. And it was terrible, and it was steady, and it would not be argued with. "My father," Eliza said, "was Amos Monroe. Some of you will have known the name once. He was a trader, a good one before the drink. When I was small, 4 or 5 years old, my mother died, and my father had a choice, which was to give me to a cousin in Boston who didn't want me, or to keep me by him on the routes. He kept me by him." A ghost of something crossed her face. "I don't say it was kindness. I think he simply couldn't be troubled to make the arrangement. But it meant that from the time I was 5 years old until I was near 16, I did not grow up in a parlor in Virginia. I grew up on the trading paths, in the camps, in the trade houses on the rivers where the Spanish and the French and the Wampanoag and the Delaware all came to do business, and a man like my father who spoke only English and only badly needed someone quick to carry his words for him." "You?" said Hale very softly. "Me." Eliza's chin was up. "I was a child, and children learn tongues the way they learn to walk without knowing they're doing it. By the time I was 10, I could carry my father's trade in 3 languages. By 12 in 4, and the Latin came later from a French priest at one of the river missions, who took pity on a girl with nothing to read and taught me my letters out of the only book he had. I did not learn these things in a parlor, Mr. Boone." "You're quite right. I learned them in the mud on the routes translating for a drunk man who beat me when the deals went poorly and forgot I existed when they went well." She let that sit. "So, there is your accounting. That is who you've been trusting tonight. A trader's girl who grew up in the camps and can speak to every man at this table because she spent her childhood being handed back and forth across every fire on the frontier like a piece of my father's stock. If that unfits me to give you the true terms of your treaty, gentlemen, then by all means close your books and go home and settle it yourselves in the 4 languages none of you speak." Nobody moved. But if it doesn't, and here her voice, which had held so level, cracked for the first time just slightly on the edge of the thing. "If it doesn't unfit me, then I'll thank Mr. Boone to remember that the same childhood he'd used to shame me is the only reason there's a soul in this room who can tell an honest word from a lie tonight. You cannot have it both ways, sir. You cannot say my learning is worthless because of where I got it, and also fear it enough to try and shame me out of using it. Which is it? Am I too low to be believed, or too dangerous to be allowed to speak? You've accused me of both in the space of 10 minutes, and I'd have you pick one." Silence. And then Chief Gray Elk stood up. The whole table startled. But the chief was not leaving this time. He had turned deliberately to face Eliza, and he spoke a long, slow run of his own tongue, and this time there was no interpreter needed for the shape of it, because the chief laid his hand flat against his own chest as he spoke over the heart and held it there. Eliza listened. And Jonathan, watching his wife's face, saw it do something it had not done all night, not through the crisis or the accusation or the terrible plain recounting of her childhood. It came apart. Her composure, which had held through everything, held through Boone and the accusation and the whole ugly airing of her wounds, it held through all of that, and it broke here on whatever the chief was saying, and her eyes filled, and she pressed her lips together hard against it. "What's he saying?" Jonathan asked low. "Eliza, what's he saying to you?" She had to steady herself before she could answer. "He says he remembers me," she said. "He says there was a trader's daughter on the northern routes years ago, a small girl who carried words between his people and the whites, and who once, when she was perhaps 11, corrected a translation that would have started a killing, and was struck by her father for it in front of everyone, for shaming him by knowing better." Her voice was not steady at all now. "He says his people did not forget her. He says they called her a name in their tongue that means—" She stopped and breathed and went on. "That means the child who would not lie. He says he did not know when he came to this house tonight that the child had lived to be a woman. And he says—" She pressed her hand briefly to her mouth. "He says he is glad. That is all. He is glad she lived." For a moment, no one at the table could look at anyone else. Then Colonel Hale cleared his throat roughly and picked up his pencil, and Jonathan understood the man was doing it to give them all somewhere to put their eyes. "Mrs. Whitaker," Hale said, and his voice was not entirely steady either. "I've heard enough accounting. I've heard more than enough. And I'll say plainly for the record and in front of witnesses that in 30 years I have never trusted an interpreter as completely as I trust the one standing in front of me now, and I've never trusted one as little as the one sitting at the end of the table. So let's proceed as honest men proceed. The crossing at the Ford Noon trade, no armed men after dark in winter disputes, settled 1 and 1 in the water. Have I got it?" "You've got it," Eliza said, gathering herself. "Word for word." "Then it's in the book." He wrote, "Next, the timber." And so it went, and for a while the room did the plain good work of it, and Jonathan sat beside his wife and watched her build a treaty out of the ruins of his dinner, thread by thread, clause by clause, and every clause she set right was one more clause Boone had set wrong, and by the third one, Jonathan had stopped keeping count because the count was too shaming to keep. But he kept watching Boone, and Boone, he saw, had changed his posture again. The man had stopped protesting. He had gone quiet. Not the beaten quiet Jonathan had waited for all night, but a working quiet. A listening quiet. His settling eyes moving from Eliza to Hale, to the paper and back, and every so often his soft hand would drift to his breast pocket and touch something there and drift away. Jonathan noted it. A shipping man learns to note the small movements of a man near his money. "Colonel," Jonathan said quietly, under the flow of the negotiation, "that pocket. Boone keeps going to it." Hale did not look up from his writing. "I marked it too. He came to this dinner with papers. He's a translator. He'd have his own copies of the terms. The ones he's been feeding you all year. He would. The false ones, in his own hand, or copied out in his own hand." Jonathan kept his voice below the level of the room. "Colonel, if a man could get those papers, the false terms in Boone's writing with his name on them, set beside the true terms my wife's giving you tonight, then I'd have a rope," Hale said softly. "Long enough to hang him from." "Yes, Whitaker. I'd thought of that too. The trouble is he knows it. That's why the coat's still in his lap, and the hand keeps going to the pocket. He's not deciding whether to run. He's deciding when." And as if the word run had carried down the table, Silas Boone stood up. "Well," he said brightly, buttoning his coat, "I can see I'm surplus to the evening's requirements. The ladies got the tongues, and the colonel's got his pencil, and none of you have the smallest use left for old Boone. So I'll bid you all good night, and I'll leave you to your treaty, and I'll only say—" He was moving now toward the door, smooth and unhurried. his hand at his breast where the papers were. "I'll only say that a great many fine agreements have been signed at fine tables by candlelight gentlemen, and precious few of them survived the morning. Enjoy your treaty. I do hope the lady's memory of 4 languages holds up as well tomorrow, in the daylight before a magistrate, as it does tonight over the Madeira." He reached the door. "Mr. Boone," Eliza said. Something in her voice stopped him. Even him. He turned one hand on the door, and Jonathan tensed to rise because if the man bolted, the papers went with him, and the rope Hale spoke of went out the door in a breast pocket and was gone. But Eliza did not tell him to stop. She did not call for him to be seized. She only looked at him across the length of the ruined table, and when she spoke, it was in a voice so mild, so almost gentle, that it raised the hair on Jonathan's arms. "You're going to the Northern Ford," she said. "Tonight, to warn your partners that the scheme is dead and to move whatever needs moving before the colonel can send a man up in the morning. That's what's in your pocket, isn't it? Not just the false terms. The list, the names. Every respectable man who bought a share in that toll road on the strength of your promise that you'd get the free ford closed." She tilted her head. "You're carrying all their names next to your heart, Mr. Boone, and you're about to ride 9 miles in the dark to protect them." Boone's face had gone the color of paper. "That's a guess," he said. "You're guessing. You can't—" "I'm not guessing." She said it so quietly. "Your men told me, on the lawn. I told you I was listening. They said Boone's got the whole list on him, and once the free ford's shut, we split it 13 ways, and no one's the wiser. 13, Mr. Boone. Not a dozen respectable men. 13. I even know it's 13. She paused. "I know the ones they laughed about. I know which of the respectable men on your list would be most surprised to find their names there. Shall I say them aloud? Here, in front of the colonel? Or would you rather sit back down and set that pocket on the table and let us settle this, like men who've been caught instead of men who are about to be chased?" It hung there. The whole night hung on it. And Jonathan, watching, understood what his wife had done, and the sheer cold brilliance of it took his breath. She had not called for the man to be seized because a seized man drops nothing and confesses less. She had done something worse. She had shown him that she already knew that the list in his pocket, the one thing he thought he was carrying to safety, was already halfway out of his hands, already spoken of, already burning. She had made the pocket worthless. She had made running pointless. She had taken the man's one card and turned it face up on the table before he'd even played it, and now he stood in the doorway holding nothing, and he knew it. "You're bluffing," Boone said, but his voice had no floor under it now. "Say a name then," Eliza said gently. "Call my bluff. Name one man you're certain isn't on that list, and I'll tell you whether you're right. But be careful, Mr. Boone, because the moment I name a man correctly, the moment this table hears me say a name that's really in your pocket, every man here will know I've read that list or heard it read, and your one road out of this room closes." She waited. "Go on, name one." Silas Boone did not name one. He stood in the doorway a long moment, a soft man with settling eyes and 13 names against his heart, and Jonathan watched the arithmetic finish behind his face, watched him understand that the woman he'd tried to shame into silence had, just without raising her voice, without calling a single guard, without so much as leaving her place, taken the door away from him. "You'll want witnesses," Eliza said, "to what's in that pocket, not me. I'm too easy to call a liar. Mr. Boone's made sure of that already tonight. You'll want the colonel to open it in front of Don Raphael and Monsieur Beaumont, so that no man can ever say the papers were tampered with. And you'll want it done now, Mr. Boone, before you've had a chance to be alone with your coat." She turned at last to her husband, and there was the faintest thing at the corner of her mouth that on any other face he'd have called the beginning of a smile. "Jonathan, would you close the door?" Jonathan Whitaker rose and crossed the room and put himself between Silas Boone and the way out. And he was not a small man, and he did not say a word. He only stood there and looked down at Boone and let his size say it. Boone's hand came away from the door. "This is—" He tried once more weakly. "This is entrapment. This is a woman's spite dressed up as—" "Colonel Hale," Eliza said, "would you ask Mr. Boone to hand you the contents of his breast pocket, And if he declines, would you ask him why a man with nothing to hide would rather run 9 miles in the dark than open his coat in a warm room? "Mr. Boone," said Colonel Hale, rising, 30 years of authority coming up straight in his spine. "The pocket, now." And Silas Boone, cornered between the size of Jonathan Whittaker at the door and the cold certainty of the woman at the table, made the last calculation of a small, conniving man who has finally fatally run out of road. His hand went to his breast, and Jonathan saw him think about the fireplace, saw him think about the candle, saw him think in one flashing instant about destroying the thing rather than surrender it. "Don't," Eliza said, sharp now, the gentleness gone. "Don't you dare put those names in the fire, Mr. Boone. There are men on that list who don't know they're on it, respectable men whose names you forged onto your scheme to make it look bigger and safer than it was. If you burn that paper, you burn the only proof that some honest man in this Commonwealth didn't rob his neighbors. You've spent all night lying, sir. Don't let the last thing you do be a lie told to save yourself that damns innocent men in the bargain." Boone's hand stopped halfway to the fire. "How do you know that?" he whispered. "The forged names. How could you possibly—" "Because I heard your men laugh about it," Eliza said. "They thought it was the cleverest part. They said Boone put the mayor's cousin on the list, and the mayor's cousin doesn't even know, and won't that be a fine surprise for him someday?" Her voice dropped. "There's a man asleep in his bed 9 miles from here whose name and good standing you've been using as a shield without his leave. Give the colonel the paper, Mr. Boone, and that man wakes up tomorrow an honest man still. Burn it, and you've made him a thief forever, with no way left to prove he wasn't. That's the choice in your hand right now. Not your freedom, his. So I'll ask you the one thing I've asked all night." She rose and came around the table toward him, slow, and the whole room watched the trader's daughter cross the floor to the cornered man. "Which is it going to be? One more lie, or the truth this once at the end?" For a long, long moment, Silas Boone stood with his hand between his heart and the fire. Then his shoulders came down, and he drew the papers out of his coat, a thick fold of them closely written, and he did not give them to Eliza, and he did not give them to Jonathan. He crossed the room past all of them to where Colonel Hale stood with his hand out, and he laid the whole fold in the colonel's palm. And the sound the papers made settling into Hale's hand was the smallest sound in the world, and it filled the entire room. "Thank you," Eliza said quietly. Boone looked at her, and Jonathan, who had spent the whole night watching this man calculate, saw the calculation finally stop, saw something almost human come up in the settling eyes, some last ember of whatever the man had been before he'd learned that words were only worth what you could sell them for. 15 years, Boone said. 15 years I carried words across that river, and no one ever once checked my figures. Not the colonel, not the traders, not the government men in Richmond. They handed me every tongue on the frontier and told me to speak it back to them, and never once thought to wonder whether I'd learned to lie in it. He looked around the room at the powerful men who had trusted him for years. You made me, you know. All of you. You wanted a rope across the river so badly, you never asked was it sound. You'd have gone on paying me to lie to you until the whole valley burned, and you'd have blamed the chief for the fire. His eyes came back to Eliza, and something in them was almost terribly like gratitude. And then one night you sat a woman at the foot of the table, who'd been where I'd been, who'd learned the same tongues in the same mud. The only difference between us, madam, is that when they beat you for knowing better, you decided to go on knowing, and when they beat me for it, his voice caught, I decided to make them pay for the privilege. He looked at the papers in Hale's hand. There's the whole of it. The false terms in my hand dated. The list 13 names, 3 of them forged, and I'll tell you which 3 because she's right. God help me, she's right that they never knew. He drew a long breath. Do what you'll do with me, Colonel. I'm too tired to run 9 miles tonight, and I find I'm too tired to lie anymore either. It's a great deal of work lying. Nobody ever tells you that. It's the hardest honest labor there is. And Silas Boone sat down, not at the table but in a chair against the wall, apart the way a man sits who has stopped being a party to the evening and become a fact to be dealt with, and put his soft face in his soft hands and said nothing more. The room let out a breath it had been holding for what felt like an hour. Colonel Hale unfolded the papers. He read the first sheet and his jaw tightened. He read the second, and Jonathan saw him go pale, then red. He read the third, and set them all down on the table very carefully, and put his flat hand on top of them, as if they might otherwise get up and cause more harm. "A year," he said to no one. "A year of my life. And it's all here. Every false clause. The closed forward. The toll, the whole rotten frame of it, in his own hand." He looked up at Eliza, and there was something in the colonel's weathered face that Jonathan had not seen there before. Not gratitude exactly, something graver than gratitude. "Mrs. Whitaker, you understand what you've done tonight, not the treaty. The treaty's the least of it, though God knows the treaty matters. You understand that if you hadn't set down that glass and spoken when you did, if you'd sat quiet the way you were meant to, the way everyone at this table, including your own husband, expected you to, that Ford closes come autumn, and the wagons pay the northern toll or turn back, and the chief's people take the blame for a hardship they never asked for. And come spring, when some settler's family goes hungry over a toll road built on a lie, somebody rides up to that northern ford with a rifle, and it starts. The whole thing. The war Hales spent a year trying to smother. It starts because a woman was too well-mannered to correct a man in public." He shook his head slowly. "You didn't save a dinner tonight, madam. You saved the valley. And you did it with your voice alone in a room where every soul but one had already agreed you didn't have one." Eliza did not answer. She had gone very still, and Jonathan understood watching her that she did not know what to do with the words that praise given plainly and in public was a coin she had handled so seldom she did not trust it not to be counterfeit. So he did the only thing he could think to do. He crossed to her, and he did not touch her, because he had not earned the right to touch her. But he stood beside her close, so that the whole room saw where he stood. "Colonel's right," he said low just for her, "and I'll spend a long time, I think, being ashamed of my part in it. But not tonight. Tonight you finished a thing. Let yourself have finished it, Eliza. You can be ashamed of me in the morning if you like. God knows you're entitled. And that of all things, not the praise, not the colonel's grave words, but her husband naming his own shame and handing her the right to it, that was the thing that finally reached her. Jonathan saw her mouth tremble, saw her master it, saw her lift her chin the way she had lifted it all night, the way he suspected she had been lifting it her whole life alone, with no one beside her to see. "There's still the timber clause," she said unsteadily, "and the Spanish harbor rights. We're not finished, Colonel. It's a long way yet till morning." "No," Hale agreed, and picked up his pencil and gave her the grace of the work. "It surely is. From the top then, Mrs. Whitaker, the timber." But before she could turn back to Gray Elk, before the good plain labor could take them all up again, Don Rafael Castillo rose from his place and drew off his right glove and did a thing that made the whole table go quiet once more. He crossed the floor to Eliza, and he bowed. Not the small polite bow a merchant gives a hostess, but a deep, formal, old-world bow. The bow of a man to a sovereign. And he took her hand bare in his, and he spoke in Spanish, slow enough that even the men who didn't have the tongue could feel the weight of it. Eliza's eyes filled again. "What did he say?" Jonathan asked. "Eliza, what did the Don say?" She had to try twice before it came. "He said," she stopped, steadied, went on. "He said that in his country, when a person saves a house from a fire, that person is given the right to sit at the head of the table for the rest of their days, and no one may ever again put them at the foot. He says he does not know the customs of Virginia." Her voice broke clean through now, and she let it. "He says he does not know where Virginia seats the ones who save the house, but he wanted the table to know where Spain would seat me." And Jonathan Whitaker looked down the length of his ruined, glorious dinner table at the colonel with his pencil and his year of lies laid bare at the chief, who had called her the child who would not lie at the Spaniard, bent over her hand at the broken interpreter in the chair against the wall at all of it. And then he looked at the empty chair at the foot of the table, where his wife had sat silent for 91 days. And he looked at his wife, standing now in the middle of the room with a merchant prince bowed over her hand and a treaty coming true out of her mouth. And Jonathan Whitaker made the second decision of the night that would change the rest of his life. He walked to the head of the table. His own chair. The tall one, the host's, the one that had been a Whitaker's, and only a Whitaker's for 3 generations. And he pulled it out. And he turned to his wife and he said, so the whole room heard him. The Don's right that he doesn't know our customs, so let me show him. In this house. His voice was not quite steady, and he did not try to make it so. In this house, Eliza, the one who saves it, sits at the head of it. Come up. Come sit where I should have sat you the day you came if I'd had the sense God gave a goose to ask you a single question. He stood behind the great chair holding it waiting. Come up to the head of the table, please. And the whole room waited with him. Eliza Whitaker looked at the great chair her husband held for her, and for a moment the whole room hung on whether she would cross to it. She did not. No, she said, gently. Not tonight, Jonathan. Something flickered across his face, and she saw it, and she put her hand up before he could mistake it. Not because I won't, because I can't. Not yet. She glanced at Colonel Hale at the papers under his flat hand, at the broken man in the chair against the wall. There's a treaty half written on that table, and a chief's people waiting cold on the lawn, and a scheme still breathing 9 miles north of here. A woman who sits down in the seat of honor before the house is out of the fire is just a woman who wanted the seat. I'll take your chair, Jonathan Whitaker, and gladly, and I'll take it in front of God and the whole Commonwealth. But I'll take it when the work's done, not before. She turned back to the table. Colonel, the timber, and Jonathan, standing behind the great empty chair, understood that his wife had just refused the head of his table more gracefully and more completely than any woman had ever accepted anything, and that he loved her. The word arrived in him plainly without ornament, the way a fact arrives, and that he had exactly no right to say so. He pushed the chair back in. The timber, he agreed. Yes. But the timber was not to be, because it was at that moment that the sound came from the lawn first. A single horse, hard-ridden, and then more 4 or 5 drumming up the long drive out of the summer dark, and then men's voices raised, and then the front door of Jonathan Whitaker's house came open without a knock. Every head at the table turned. Gray Elk came up out of his chair, and Jonathan saw the chief's hand move to his side, where a knife would be if a knife were allowed at a peace table, and find nothing, and close on nothing. Don Raphael's flat eyes went to the door and stayed there. Hale swept the papers off the cloth in one motion and inside his coat. Bootsteps in the hall, more than one man's, and Silas Boone in his chair against the wall lifted his soft face out of his soft hands, and for the first time all night something moved through him that was not calculation and was not shame. It was fear. Oh, Boone said softly. Oh no. No, no. They came. Who came? Jonathan said. He was already moving to put himself between the door and his wife. Boone, who came? Who? I told you. Boone's voice had gone thin. I told all of you up on the lawn tonight before I knew how the evening would go. I told my partners the free ford would be closed by morning. I sent a boy up the north road at sundown with the good news. He swallowed. And now the evening's gone another way entirely, and I never sent a second boy to untell them, and they've ridden down to celebrate a thing that isn't going to happen. They don't know. They don't know the scheme's dead. They think... His eyes went round the room. They think they're riding into a victory. The door of the dining room swung open. The man who stood in it was not soft. That was the first thing Jonathan marked the way a shipping man marks the tonnage of a thing before he marks anything else. Where Boone was soft and settling, this man was hard, and still perhaps 50 dressed well dust of the road on his good coat, and behind him in the hall, the shapes of 4 more younger, rougher and armed. The man in the doorway wore a pistol at his hip, like a thing he'd used. Silas. The man's voice was easy, warm, pleased. You old dog. I got your boy's message. Ford's closed by morning, he said. So I thought, well, no sense waiting till morning to shake the hand of the man who did it. He came into the room, and his easy eyes went round the table, taking the measure of it. The colonel, the chief, the Spaniard, the Frenchman. Jonathan watched the ease slowly leave the man's face as he counted the company and found it was the wrong company entirely for a victory. "Silas," the man said again, and now there was no warmth in it. "Why is the chief still here?" Boone said nothing. "Silas." The man's hand had not moved to the pistol. It didn't need to. Every man in the room had already seen it was there. "I asked you a question. The boy said the deal was done. Free Ford closed our ford the only crossing and we split it 13 ways. That's what the boy said. So why is the chief still sitting at this table looking at me like I'm the thing he came here to hunt?" "Because the deal's not done, Mr. Calder," Boone said. His voice cracked on the name, and Jonathan filed it Calder. "The deal's dead. It came apart tonight. They found me out. All of it. The false terms. The list." He couldn't meet the man's eyes. "I gave the colonel the papers, Calder. I'm sorry. They had me cold. There was a—" He could not bring himself to say it. "There was someone here who spoke the tongues, who checked my figures. First time in 15 years, and it had to be tonight, and it—" "Someone who spoke the tongues," Calder repeated. His eyes went round the table again, slower this time, hunting. "Which one? The Spaniard? The old Frenchman?" His gaze passed over Eliza, standing quiet at Jonathan's shoulder, and did not stop because there was no reason in the world for it to stop. "Which of you," Calder said to the men, "cost me a toll road?" And Jonathan Whitaker, before his wife could speak, before she could put herself forward, the way she'd put herself forward all night, stepped square in front of her and said, "I did." He felt Eliza go still behind him. "You," Calder said. "This is my house." Jonathan kept his voice level, kept his hands loose and open at his sides where the man could see them. "This is my table. That's my treaty in the colonel's coat, and my roof over every head in this room, including yours, uninvited as it is. And yes, Mr. Calder, I cost you your toll road. Me. So if you've come 9 miles in the dark to shake a hand or break a jaw, you'll do it with mine, and you'll leave the rest of this table out of it." It was a lie. It was a bald, deliberate, self-offered lie, and Eliza understood in an instant why he told it. He was doing for her exactly what she had done for the mayor's cousin, an hour before, standing between an innocent name and a ruin it never asked for. And she understood too, with a lurch of something she had no name for, that in 3 months her husband had never once stood between her and anything, and that he was doing it now, and that he would take a bullet meant for her rather than let this man learn she was in the room. And she loved him for it, and she was furious with him for it in the same breath. Because it wasn't going to work. "No," Boone said. Everyone looked at the broken man in the chair. "No, Calder, it wasn't him." Boone's voice was very quiet and very tired, and Jonathan understood that whatever the man had left in him, he was spending the last of it now, and could not have said why, even if you'd asked him. "It wasn't Whitaker. Whitaker's a shipping man. He can't tell the chief's tongue from a dog barking. It was—" Boone's eyes went helplessly to Eliza. "It was the woman." The room went cold. Calder turned, and Jonathan Whitaker watched the hard, easy, dangerous eyes of the man in the doorway travel at last to his wife, travel to the quiet woman in the plain dress standing at her husband's shoulder. The woman every man in the room had been trained by a lifetime of habit to look past and settle on her and change. "Her," Calder said, flat, disbelieving. "The woman. You're telling me a woman?" "His wife," Boone said. "Mrs. Whitaker. She speaks 4 tongues, Calder. 5. She grew up on the roots. She caught every false word I put on that table tonight, and she caught the scheme, and she caught the list, and she—" His voice dropped. "She knew about the forged names, the 3 that don't know. She knew about all of it. There's no toll road, Calder. There's no 13 ways. There's a treaty coming true in the next room, and a woman who killed your scheme with her voice, and you rode 9 miles to walk into the middle of it, and there's not one thing left to do here tonight but turn around and go home before the colonel there decides to remember your face." For a moment Calder said nothing at all. Then he laughed. It was not a good sound. "A woman," he said again, and shook his head, and the laugh went out of him, and what came into his face instead was worse. You know, Silas, I could have forgiven you a lot tonight. I could have forgiven the deal going bad. Deals go bad. But you're standing there telling me in front of your betters, in front of the colonel, in front of the chief, that 15 years of your work, and a year of mine, and a toll road worth more money than this whole valley sees in a decade, all came apart because you couldn't out-talk a farmer's daughter at a dinner party. His hand moved at last to rest on the butt of the pistol. Not drawing, just resting. That's not a thing a man forgives, Silas. That's a thing a man corrects. Mr. Calder. Colonel Hale's voice came across the room like a dropped iron bar. I'd think very carefully about the next thing you do. You're in a house full of witnesses, and one of them's a chief whose people are on the lawn, and one of them's a merchant of the Spanish crown, and one of them's a colonel of the United States government with a year's worth of your forgery inside his coat. Whatever you rode down here meaning to do, it was a thing you meant to do quiet. And there is nothing quiet left in this room. There could be, Calder said, and his eyes had not left Eliza. There could be, Colonel, if the right things went into the fire and the right people forgot the right names. Papers burn, memories fade. A woman who caused a great deal of trouble by talking could learn to be quiet again. Women mostly do, given a reason. Jonathan moved. He did not think about it. His body did it a half-step that put more of himself in front of his wife, that squared him toward the armed man in the door, and the two younger men behind Calder came forward a pace at the movement, and one of them put his hand on his own pistol, and the whole room drew a single breath and held it. You'll want to stop there, Whitaker, Calder said. I've got 4 men, and you've got a table of diplomats. You do the arithmetic. I've done it, Jonathan said. You come into my house past my door with your hand on your gun, and you stand there and you tell me to my face in front of my wife that you'd see her frightened back into silence, or worse, to save a toll road that's already dead. So here's my arithmetic, Calder. You can shoot me. You've the men and the guns, and you can surely do it. But you'll do it in front of a colonel of the government, and a chief of the Wampanoag, and a merchant of Spain, and when the smoke clears, you'll be a man who murdered his host at a peace table. And there is not a hole deep enough in this country for you to climb into after that. You'll have your quiet. It'll be the quiet of a man they hunt to the end of his days. He did not move. So do your arithmetic again. Because I've done mine, and I'd rather be dead on my own floor than alive in a house where a man like you got to tell my wife to be quiet. The room was so still, Jonathan could hear the candles. And then a voice spoke that was not his, and not Calder's, and not the colonel's. He's not going to shoot anyone, Eliza said. She stepped out from behind her husband. Jonathan grabbed for her, Eliza, no, and she moved past his hand, calm, unhurried, and put herself in the open, where Calder could see the whole of her, and Jonathan's heart went into his throat, because she had just taken away the one thing he had to give her, which was his body between her and the gun. He's not going to shoot anyone, Eliza said again to the room, but her eyes were on Calder, because a man who came here to shake Silas Boone's hand over a quiet, secret, profitable little scheme is not a man who wants a killing. A killing is loud, Mr. Calder. A killing is the loudest thing there is. You're a man who spent a year working in the dark through other men's mouths, so that your name never once had to appear on anything. And now you're standing in a lit room full of the most important witnesses in the Commonwealth, with your hand on a gun. And I can see you doing the same arithmetic my husband did, and I can see you coming to the same answer. You didn't come here to be seen. And there's no way to fire that pistol that doesn't get you seen forever. Calder's jaw worked. You've got a lot of mouth on you, he said, for a farmer's daughter. I've been told that tonight already, Eliza said, by a better liar than you. So let me save you the trouble he went to, and tell you plainly what your choices are, because I've been doing some since I was 5 years old, and I'm faster at it than you. She took another step toward him, and Jonathan nearly came out of his skin, and she did not stop. Your first choice is you shoot someone, and you hang, and everyone on your list hangs with you because the colonel's got the papers, and the papers have the names. That's a bad sum, Mr. Calder. Everyone loses. Even the men asleep in their beds who never knew you'd forged them onto your scheme, they lose too, because a hanged man's list gets read out at the trial and their good names go into the mud beside yours. Eliza, Jonathan breathed. Your second choice, she went on, is you turn around and ride back up the North Road and pretend tonight never happened. But it did happen, Mr. Calder. 6 men saw your face. The colonel's got your forgery. The moment you're up that road, the colonel sends a rider to Richmond, and by the time you've got your boots off tonight, there's a warrant with your name on it, and you spend the rest of your life a hunted man. That's a better sum than the first, but it's not a good one. And I suppose, Calder said, you've got a third. I have. And here Eliza did the thing that made Jonathan Whittaker understand finally and completely that he had spent 3 months living with a mind he could not have measured, with a plumb line dropped to the bottom of the sea. She turned not to Calder, but to Colonel Hale. Colonel, that list, 13 names. 3 of them forged onto it against the owner's knowledge, which leaves 10 men who put their money into this scheme with their eyes open. She turned back to Calder. 10 men. Mr. Calder, respectable men, most of them, men with farms and standing and families who tonight are guilty of nothing worse than being greedy and being fooled. They haven't robbed anyone yet. The scheme died before it took a single dollar out of a single wagon. 10 men who are at this hour exactly 1 confession away from being ruined and 1 silence away from being free. The room had gone very quiet in a different way now. Even Calder was listening. So here is my third sum, Eliza said. You give the colonel your full and honest confession tonight in writing in front of these witnesses of the whole scheme from the top in your own words. You name yourself. You take the weight of it, all of it, onto your own back where it belongs, because it was your money and your plan and your man Boone doing your talking. And in exchange the colonel considers, I say considers. I promise nothing. It's his to give, and not mine, whether the 10 men who followed you might be dealt with quietly. Fined perhaps. Warned, made to sign an oath and forfeit their share and never spoken of again. Ruined in their purses, but not in their names. And the 3 forged men wake up tomorrow, having never been on any list at all, because you'll have testified they were forged, and testified it in front of a chief and a colonel and a merchant prince, who none of them will ever be called liars. She let it settle. You lose everything either way, Mr. Calder. That was decided the moment I set down my glass tonight. You just didn't know it till now. The only question left on the table is how many men you take down with you. All 12, or none but yourself. Silence. You'd have me hang alone, Calder said slowly, to save a pack of men who'd have profited off my back and never thanked me for it. I'd have you choose, Eliza said, between being a thief who took 11 other men to ruin and being a thief who, at the very end, when he'd lost everything and had nothing left to gain by it, did one single decent thing and let the smaller fish swim. That's the whole of what's left to you tonight, sir. Your money's gone. Your scheme's gone. Your freedom's likely gone. But the one thing no man can take from you that you can only give away yourself is which kind of ruined man you're going to be. She held his eyes. I grew up watching my father make that choice 100 times, Mr. Calder, at 100 fires when the deals went bad. And he chose wrong every single time. He took everyone down with him always because he could not bear to fall alone. Her voice dropped, and Jonathan heard something in it that was not for Calder at all. Something old and private and scarred. I've spent my whole life wishing just once I'd seen a cornered man choose the other way. Show me one? Mr. Calder, I'm 24 years old and I've never seen it. Show me a man can fall without pulling the world down after him. For a long moment, nobody in the room breathed, and Calder's hand came off the pistol. It was not surrender exactly. Jonathan, watching, thought it was something more complicated and more human than surrender, the look of a man who has been handed at the very bottom of his life. One small, clean thing to do by the only person in the room who'd bothered to offer him a way to be anything but a monster. Get me a pen, Calder said roughly to no one. And paper. If I'm doing it before I lose the nerve. And you. He pointed at Boone, and there was no anger left in it, only a bone-deep weariness. You're going to sit there and correct me if I leave anything out, because I'll be damned if I'm the only one whose name goes on this in full." "Yes," Boone said quietly. "Yes, all right." And Colonel Hale moving fast before either man could change his mind. 30 years of knowing how to close a thing before it opened back up, had the pen and the ink and a clean sheet on the table, and Calder pulled out a chair. The chair, Jonathan realized with a start, was the great host's chair at the head of the table, the one he'd offered Eliza, and no one stopped him, because it was nearer than any other, and there was a terrible fitting justice in the man who'd tried to steal a valley, sitting down in the seat of honor, to write out how he'd tried to do it. He wrote for a long time, and while he wrote, the room slowly came back to life around him. Hale standing over his shoulder, reading each line as it dried. Don Raphael by the window, watching the drive in case the 4 men outside decided their leader was taking too long. Beaumont pouring wine for the chief with his own hands, an old Frenchman's courtesy. Gray Elk sitting still as stone, missing nothing. And Eliza stepped back at last out of the open where the gun had been, and came to stand beside her husband. And Jonathan felt her arm not quite touching his, and heard her let out a breath that, had he realized, been held for a very long time. Held perhaps since she was 5 years old, at a fire on the routes, watching a cornered man choose wrong. "You're shaking," he said very low, so only she could hear. "Am I?" she said. She looked down at her own hand as if it belonged to someone else. It was trembling badly. "So I am. I didn't feel it." A small broken sound came out of her that was almost a laugh. "I never feel it while it's happening, only after. My father used to say I had ice in me. He didn't know it all came due later when the room emptied. He was never there for the after." She pressed her shaking hand flat against her skirt to still it. No one ever was. And Jonathan Whitaker, who had not touched his wife in 3 months, who had shared a house and a name and a table with her, and never once. His hand, Jonathan reached down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and covered her trembling hand with his own. She went still. "I'm here for the after," he said. "I know it's 91 days late. I know I forfeited the right to say it. But I'm here for this one, Eliza, and every after that comes, if you'll have me at them. Even at the foot of the table, if that's all you'll allow me. I'd rather be at the foot of your table than the head of any other in this country." For a moment she did not move at all. Then under his hand, her trembling fingers turned over and gripped his hard, harder than he'd have thought a hand that small could grip, and she did not look at him. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead on the man writing his confession at the head of the table. But she gripped her husband's hand, like a person going down in cold water who has felt against all hope another hand close over theirs. "You talk a great deal," she said unsteadily, "for a man who spent 3 months saying nothing to me but yes and no. I'm making up for lost time. You've a great deal of it to make up. I know it. I mean to try." She said nothing to that, but she did not let go of his hand, and that was how they were standing. The shipping man and the trader's daughter, hand gripped in hand in the middle of the ruined dining room, watching a broken man write out the truth by candlelight when Calder set down the pen. "It's done," he said. His voice was hollow. "The whole of it. From the day I first thought of the ford to the boy I sent up the road tonight. 10 men who knew and 3 who didn't, and I've marked which is which, and I've signed it, and Silas has signed under me, and God have mercy on us both." He pushed the papers across the table toward Hale and did not look at them again. "There, you've got your rope, Colonel. Both ropes, mine and his." Hale gathered the sheets. He read the last of them standing, and when he'd finished, he was quiet a moment, and then he folded the confession in with the forged terms and the list, all of it together, and buttoned the whole weight of it inside his coat over his heart. "I've got a year of my life back," Hale said, "and a valley that isn't going to burn, and 2 men to deliver to a magistrate, and 10 more to frighten half to death and turn honest, and 3 good names to hand back clean to men who'll never know how close they came." He looked around the room at all of them. "In 30 years, I've never had a night like this one. I hope to God I never have another. I don't think my heart would stand it twice. Colonel?" It was Gray Elk. He had risen and he spoke, and Eliza turned to translate, but the chief lifted a hand not to stop her, but to ask her to wait, and then to the astonishment of the whole room, he spoke again, slowly, carefully in English. Broken accented plainly, costing him great effort, plainly a tongue he had chosen to keep hidden all night behind the safety of an interpreter, the way Eliza had kept hers hidden behind 3 months of silence. "My people," Grey Elk said in English to the whole table, "wait outside, in the cold. They think maybe tonight the peace dies, maybe tomorrow the guns." He paused, gathering the hard words. "I go now. I tell them. The peace lives." He turned and he looked at Eliza, and he put his hand over his heart once more. Because the child who would not lie, she grew up, and she still will not lie. Not for money, not for a gun in the door, not for a husband who did not see her. His dark eyes moved briefly to Jonathan, and there was no cruelty in it, but there was no mercy either, only a plain accounting, the accounting of a man who missed nothing. "You are a lucky man, Whitaker. Luckier than you know yet. I hope you live long enough to learn how lucky." And Jonathan Whitaker, holding his wife's hand in his own, in the wreck of his dining room, with a saved treaty in the colonel's coat, and a broken scheme confessed on the table, and a chief telling him plainly, in front of God and everyone, that he had been a fool, who did not deserve what he'd been given. Jonathan looked down at Eliza, at the woman he had put at the foot of his table, and forgotten for 3 months, at the mind he had never troubled to meet, at the hand gripping his so hard it hurt, and he said in a voice that was not steady at all, "I know it. God help me, I'm only beginning to know it. But I mean to spend the rest of my life learning." They took Calder and Boone away near 2 in the morning, when the colonel's men had ridden down from the county seat, and the 4 riders on the lawn had melted into the dark the moment their leader walked out in irons, and the chief's people had gone back across the river with word that the peace would hold. And then the house was empty and quiet, and Jonathan Whitaker stood in the wreck of his dining room and did not know what to do with his own hands. Eliza was clearing the table. That was the thing that undid him. After all of it, the treaty, the confession, the gun in the doorway, the chief calling her the child who would not lie. After all of it, his wife had picked up 2 wine glasses and was carrying them quietly toward the kitchen, the way she had carried things quietly in his house for 91 days, because no one had ever told her she was anything but the woman who carried things. "Leave it," he said. She stopped. "Leave it, Eliza. For God's sake. A servant can see to glasses. You just saved a valley. You don't clear a table after saving a valley." "I don't know what else to do with myself," she said. It came out simpler and more honest than she'd meant it, he could tell, because she looked faintly surprised at her own words. "It's what my hands know. When the room empties and the shaking comes, I find a thing to do with my hands. It's how I get through the after." She set the glasses down carefully on the sideboard. "I told you, no one was ever there for the after. So I made a habit of the hands." Jonathan crossed the room to her. "Come sit," he said. "Not the head of the table. I've stopped trying to force that on you tonight. You've told me twice, and I've the sense to hear it now. Just come sit. By the window. I'll build the fire back up, and you'll tell me the thing I should have asked you the day you came into this house, and every day since, and never did." He pulled a chair around for her, and then, because he did not trust himself to say it standing, he crouched down in front of it, so that for once he was looking up at her and not down. "Who are you, Eliza Monroe? I married you 3 months ago, and I don't know the first true thing about you. So tell me, from the beginning. I've all night. I've all my life if you'll spend it telling me." For a moment she just looked at him. And then, something in her face, some last door that had held shut through the whole long, terrible night, held shut through the gun and the confession and the praise she didn't trust. That door came open, and what was behind it was not the composed woman who'd faced down Calder. It was something younger and more wounded, and it came out of her in a rush the way water comes when the thing holding it finally gives. "You want to know who I am?" Her voice wavered. "I'll tell you who I am, Jonathan. I'm a woman who learned before she was 6 years old that the safest thing she could be was quiet. That's who I am. Everything else is just decoration on that." She pressed her hands together in her lap. "My father beat me the first time for correcting his Spanish. I was 5. I'd heard him tell a Spanish trader a price, and he'd got the number wrong, said 100 when he meant 1,000. And I tugged his sleeve and told him in front of the man that he'd said it wrong. And the trader laughed. And my father... She stopped, started again. My father did not like to be laughed at. So he taught me that night what happened to little girls who made their fathers look foolish by knowing things. And I learned. God, I learned it well. I learned to hold every word in my mouth until I was certain no one wanted it. I learned that being right out loud in front of people was the most dangerous thing a girl could do. Eliza, let me finish. You asked. You have to let me finish, because I've never once said it aloud, and I don't know that I'll have the courage twice. She drew a breath. So I got very good at being quiet. I carried my father's words for him because he needed me to, and I never once corrected him again, where anyone could hear, not for 11 years, no matter how wrong he was, no matter what the wrongness cost, and it cost Jonathan, it cost deals, and it cost trust. And once, it very nearly cost a man his life at a fire on the Ohio, because my father mistranslated a threat, and I knew it, and I said nothing. I said nothing, because I'd learned what happened when I spoke. Her voice broke clean through. The child who would not lie. The chief called me that tonight, and I nearly came apart because he doesn't know. He never knew that for 11 years I lied every single day. Not with words, with silence. I let my father's lies stand because I was too afraid of his hand to correct them. That's not a child who would not lie, Jonathan. That's a child who was too frightened to tell the truth. The chief remembers the one time I broke. The one time when I was 11, when the lie was so ugly I couldn't hold it, and I corrected it, and I was struck for it in front of everyone. He remembers that one time. He doesn't remember the 10,000 times I stayed quiet and let the lie win. Jonathan Whitaker knelt in front of his wife's chair and felt something crack open in his own chest that he had kept shut a long time himself. So when my father died, Eliza went on quieter, now spent, and there was nothing left. No money. Only the Monroe name that used to mean something, and a cousin who arranged to marry me off to a wealthy Virginia shipping man who wanted a respectable wife and asked no questions. I thought, well, that's all right. I know how to be quiet. I've had a lifetime of practice. I'll go to his fine house and I'll sit at his table and I'll hold every word in my mouth the way I always have, and it'll be safe, and no one will ever be struck for anything, because no one will ever know there's anything in me worth striking. She looked at him, and her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady in that terrible way she had. I came into your house planning to be exactly what you thought you'd bought. Silent, ordinary, safe. And you made it so easy, Jonathan. You never asked. 3 months, and you never asked me one single question I couldn't answer with a nod. And I told myself I was grateful. I told myself this is what safe feels like. A man who doesn't ask can't be disappointed. A woman who doesn't speak can't be struck. Her hand came up and pressed against her mouth for a moment, then dropped. And then tonight, I watched your whole life start to burn over a lie I could stop with 3 words. And I sat there, Jonathan. I want you to know that. For a long, long moment tonight, I sat there at the foot of your table, and I did the sum the way I always do, and the sum said, stay quiet. It's safer. It's not your affair. No one's asked you. No one ever asks you, and I nearly stayed quiet. I nearly let it burn. Because 11 years of my father's hand were louder in me than one dying treaty. But you didn't, Jonathan said. His voice was rough. You spoke. I set down my glass, she said. And I thought if I stay quiet now, I am my father. I let the lie win, and men die at the ford, and I sit here safe with my hands folded exactly the way I've sat safe my whole life, while other people paid for my silence. And I could not... Her voice cracked. I could not be that again. Not one more time. Not in front of you. I don't even know why it mattered that it was in front of you, but it did. God help me, it did. She wiped at her face, roughly angry at her own tears. So there. That's who you married, Jonathan Whitaker. A coward who learned to be brave exactly once a decade, whether she needed to or not. I hope she was worth the fine wedding." For a long moment, Jonathan could not speak at all. Then he took both her hands in both of his, there on his knees in front of her chair, and he held them. And when he found his voice, it was not the voice of the proud, disciplined shipping man the county knew. It was lower than that, and it shook. "I'm going to tell you what I heard," he said, "because I don't think you can hear it yet said the way you just said it. So let me say it back to you the true way." He tightened his grip on her hands. "I heard a little girl of 5 get beaten for being right, and learn the way any creature learns to keep its hand off a hot stove that being right out loud would burn her. That's not cowardice, Eliza. A child who stops touching the stove isn't a coward. She's a child who was burned doing the only thing a burned child knows to do." His jaw worked. "And I heard that same girl carry 11 years of a drunk man's lies, because the one time she told the truth, she got knocked down in front of a crowd of grown men, and not one of those grown men, not one, Eliza stood up and said, 'Leave the child be.' She was right. 11 years. And in all that time, not a single soul in this whole country ever once stood between you and the hand that taught you to be quiet." She had gone very still. "And then tonight," Jonathan said, "with everything you'd ever learned screaming at you to stay safe, to stay quiet, to fold your hands and let it burn the way you'd been taught your whole life to let things burn, you set down your glass. You alone, with no one beside you, the way you've done every brave thing in your life alone. And you spoke. And you saved every soul in this room." His voice broke. "That's not a coward, Eliza. Do you understand me? I have known brave men. I have sailed with men who ran cannon fire and thought nothing of it. And not one of them ever did a braver thing than a frightened girl setting down a wine glass in a room where she'd been taught silence was the only thing that kept her safe. You didn't learn to be brave once a decade. You learned to be brave with a lifetime of good reasons not to be, which is the only kind of brave that counts for anything." Eliza Whitaker began quietly to cry. Not the controlled, mastered tears she'd fought down all night. These came up out of somewhere deeper, somewhere that had been held shut a very long time, and they shook her. And Jonathan did the only thing left to do. He came up off his knees and gathered his wife against him and held her, while 11 years came out of her, and 11 years is a long time, and it took a while. He did not tell her to stop. He did not tell her it was all right. He'd learned that much tonight at least, that some things a person carries are too big to be told they're all right. He only held on and let her be not all right against his chest for as long as she needed, and that he understood dimly was the thing no one had ever once given her. Not comfort, not reassurance, just a person who would stay for the after. When at last she quieted, she did not pull away. That was how he knew something had changed. She stayed where she was, her cheek against his coat, worn out, emptied, and when she spoke her voice was small and tired, and had no defenses left in it at all. "No one ever asked me anything," she said. "That's the whole of it, Jonathan. That sentence you couldn't answer earlier when the colonel asked how I learned the tongues, and I said it was a longer story than the night had room for. That was the story. No one ever asked. Not my father, not my cousin, not you. A whole life, and until tonight, not one person in it ever once looked at me and wanted to know what was inside." She was quiet a moment. "And the terrible thing, the thing I'm ashamed of, is that I let it become a comfort. Being unasked. I built a little house inside the silence, and I lived in it, and I called it safety. And I might have lived in it till I died if that treaty hadn't started to burn." Jonathan held her a moment longer. Then he set her back gently just far enough to see her face. "Then I'm going to ask you things," he said, "for the rest of my life. I'm going to ask you so many questions you'll get sick to death of me. What you think, what you know, what you do. I'm going to ask you about the harbor contracts, and the shipping ledgers, and every negotiation I've ever bungled by not having you in the room. I'm going to ask you which tongue is your favorite and why, and what the French priest was like, and whether you've ever once in your life read a book only because you wanted to, and not because it was the only book to hand." His voice thickened. "You are never going to be unasked again, Eliza Whitaker. Not in this house. I'll pester you with questions till you beg me for an hour's silence, and then I'll ask you what you'd like to do with the hour. You've had a lifetime of no one wanting to know. You're going to have the rest of one with a man who can't stop wanting to." She looked at him for a long moment. And then something happened in her face that Jonathan had not seen once in 91 days, not through the whole long night, not ever. She smiled. It was small, and it was worn, and it was wet at the edges. But it was real, and it reached all the way up into her eyes, and it changed her whole face into something he had never been given to see. And Jonathan Whittaker understood that he would spend the rest of his life doing whatever needed doing to see it again. "You'll regret that," she said. "I know a great many things. I could talk your ear clean off. I'm counting on it. About tariffs, and treaty law, and the price of Spanish silver in 6 ports. About everything," he said. "God, yes. About everything." And they might have stayed there till dawn, the two of them in the wreck of the dining room, finally meeting for the first time 3 months into their marriage, except that a knock came at the front door. They both went still. It was very late for a knock. Too late. Jonathan felt Eliza tense in his arms, and he felt his own gut tighten, because a knock at this hour on this night, after everything. It could be Calder's men come back for revenge. It could be one of the 10 guilty men come to plead or to threaten. It could be 100 kinds of trouble a night like this one dragged behind it like a wake. "Stay here," Jonathan said. And this time she let him say it. This time she did not step out from behind him, and he understood the difference. She'd stepped into the open before Calder, because the danger there was one only she could meet, and she stayed behind Jonathan now because this was a danger he could meet, and she had, in the space of one night, learned to let another person carry a thing. It was such a small learning. It nearly broke his heart how small it was, and how much it must have cost. He went to the door with the poker from the fire in his hand. He opened it. Colonel Matthew Hale stood on the step. Alone. Still in his road-dusted coat, gray-faced with exhaustion, and Jonathan lowered the poker and felt the fright go out of him, and then looking at the colonel's face, felt a different fright come in, because the colonel did not look like a man come to say goodnight. "I'm sorry for the hour," Hale said. "I'd not have come back tonight if it could wait. It can't." He looked past Jonathan into the house. "Is your wife still awake?" "What I've come to say, I'd as soon say to you both. It concerns her more than it concerns you. If I'm honest, and it's not a thing I want to say to a man, and have him carry it to his wife second-hand. She's earned better than second-hand. She's earned it from my own mouth." Jonathan stepped back and let him in. Eliza had come to the door of the dining room, and she stood there spent and hollow-eyed and steady, and the colonel took his hat off to her, a thing Jonathan noted. A colonel of the government taking his hat off to a trader's daughter in a plain dress at 2 in the morning, and he did not sit when Jonathan offered him a chair. "Mrs. Whittaker," Hale said. "I'll be quick, because you're both worn to the bone, and so am I. When I got to the county seat with Calder and Boone, there was a rider waiting. From Richmond. He'd been sent 3 days ago before any of tonight on another matter entirely, and he'd been asking after me all up and down the county." Hale turned his hat in his hands. "The government's got a problem, Mrs. Whittaker, a bad one. There's a treaty conference called for the fall, a real one, a large one, Spanish and French, and 4 native nations, and the government all at one table up on the northern frontier to settle the boundaries for good, and stop the very kind of war we nearly lit tonight from lighting itself a dozen times over." He paused. "And they have no one to interpret it. The man they had lined up died of a fever 3 weeks past. The men they've got left are men like Boone men who speak 2 tongues badly and lie in both. Richmond's been tearing its hair out. They sent a rider to ask me personally whether in all my years on the frontier I'd ever once met a soul who could be trusted at a table like that, in 4 tongues, honestly, without a scheme in their pocket. The room had gone very quiet. "I have," Colonel Hale said. "For the first time in 30 years tonight I have, and I rode back here at 2 in the morning worn past standing because I could not sleep without asking. Mrs. Whittaker." He looked her full in the face. "Would you interpret at the Northern Conference this fall for the government of the United States? At the biggest table on the frontier, with the peace of the whole territory, riding on whether the words come across true, Eliza Whittaker went white. Jonathan watched it hit her, watched the offer land on a woman who had spent her whole life being told to be quiet, being told her learning came from the mud and unfit her for decent company, being handed back and forth across fires like a piece of her father's stock. Watched the government of the United States, through the mouth of a colonel with his hat in his hands, ask her to be the one honest voice at the most important table on the continent. "Colonel," she said. Her voice was not steady. "I'm a woman. I'm aware of it. They won't have a woman at that table. The Spanish won't. The government won't. Men don't let women speak in men's affairs. I've had that said to me twice tonight already, once by a liar, and once by a killer, and they were the only two men in this house who agreed on anything." She shook her head. "You'll bring me up there, and they'll turn me away at the door, and you'll have staked your name on a woman for nothing. Mrs. Whitaker." Hale's voice was very level. "Tonight I watched a room full of the proudest men on this frontier, a Spanish grandee, a Wampanoag chief, a French trader, who's forgotten more about pride than the rest of us ever learned. I watched every one of them stop and turn and listen, and in the end bow to a woman they'd all agreed not to see when she walked in the door. Don Rafael Castillo kissed your hand and told you where Spain would seat you. The chief spoke English for the first time in front of white men tonight to honor you. Those aren't men who let women speak in men's affairs, ma'am. Those are men who let the truth speak and were wise enough to know it when they heard it, whatever throat it came out of." He set his jaw. "The men at the northern table will turn you away at the door. You're right. For about 10 minutes. And then the talks will start to go bad the way they always do, because someone will lie, or someone will stammer, or someone will say wall when they mean boundary, and I will stand up, and I will say, 'Gentlemen, I have a person outside this door who can fix what's just broken, and I'd stake my career. She can do it because I've seen her do it in a house on the James River, on a night when the whole valley was one bad word away from burning. And they will let you in, because by then they'll want the truth worse than they want their pride. Men always do in the end. It just takes them a while." Eliza did not answer, and Jonathan, watching his wife stand frozen in the doorway with the offer of her whole life held out to her, understood that this was the true test of the night. Not the treaty, not the gun, but this. Whether the woman who had learned that being wanted for her gift was dangerous could believe at last that she was being wanted for her gift and that it was safe. He almost spoke. He almost said, "Of course she'll do it. She'd be magnificent." And then he stopped himself because he understood, with the first real understanding he'd had of her in 3 months, that if he answered for her, he'd have undone everything. He'd have made himself one more man deciding what she'd do. So he held his tongue harder than he'd ever held it, and he waited, and he let the silence be hers to fill. Eliza looked at him. Just once. A quick glance, checking the way she'd checked all night, checking whether he'd take the choice from her, whether he'd decide it for her, the way every man in her life had decided everything for her. And Jonathan Whitaker looked back at his wife and said nothing at all, and gave her the whole weight of her own life to hold and let her see that he trusted her to hold it. Something in her face steadied. "There's a condition," Eliza said, turning back to Hale. "Name it." 2 conditions. Her voice was finding its floor again, coming back up out of the shock, and Jonathan felt his chest fill watching it. "The first is that when they turn me away at the door, and they will, you don't argue for me. You don't stand up and stake your career on me. You let me stand there, and you say nothing, and you make them come to me. Because I have spent my whole life being spoken for Colonel, and if I'm to do this, I'll do it as the person who was proven right, not the person the Colonel vouched for. I'll not trade one man deciding my worth for another, even a kind one." She let that land. "When they want the truth badly enough to come to the door and ask the woman they turned away, then I'll come in, not before. Can you agree to that? Can you stand there and let them insult me and say nothing and trust me to be worth the wait?" For a moment, Hale looked at her, and then slowly the weathered face did something rare. It broke into a smile of pure, tired, astonished admiration. 30 years, he said, and I've never had a soul set that condition. They always want the vouching. They always want the powerful man to clear the road for them. He shook his head. Yes, Mrs. Whitaker. I'll stand there and hold my tongue and let them come to you. God help me, I think I'll enjoy it. And the second condition. Eliza turned then and looked at her husband. And there was something new in her face, something that had not been there an hour ago. Something that had been born tonight, somewhere between the gun in the doorway and the 11 years that came out of her against his chest. The second condition, she said, is that my husband comes with me, not to speak for me, not to vouch for me, not to stand in front of me. Her voice wavered just once and steadied. To be there for the after. There'll be an after every single night of that conference, the shaking, the emptying out, the coming apart when the room's gone dark. I've done every after of my life alone, Colonel. Every one. And I find having done just one of them tonight with someone's hand over mine that I don't care to go back to doing them alone. She held Jonathan's eyes. If he'll come. And Jonathan Whitaker, who 3 months ago had married a woman he thought was a plain and silent burden, and who had that very night watched her save a valley with her voice, and refused the head of his table, and stare down a killer, and lay open 11 years of pain against his chest. Jonathan crossed the room to his wife and took her hand, the way he'd sworn to himself he would take it at every after for the rest of his life. And he said, so that the Colonel and God and the whole waking world could hear him, "Try and stop me." They turned her away at the door, just as she'd said they would. The Northern Conference had been 3 days assembling when the Whitakers arrived, and when Colonel Hale brought Eliza to the great hall where the tables were set, a government man in a good coat looked her up and down once and told her not unkindly that the ladies' arrangements were in the other building. "She's not here as a lady," Hale said. "She's here to interpret." The man laughed. He actually laughed, and behind him 2 more men laughed with him, and one of the Spanish attachés said something under his breath in Castilian that Jonathan didn't understand, but that made Eliza's jaw tighten because she understood it perfectly. "Colonel." The government man wiped his eyes. "I know you've spent your life on the frontier, and it's given you some unusual notions. But we cannot seat a woman at the boundary table. The Spanish would walk out. The Iroquois delegates would think we were mocking them. It simply isn't done, and it isn't going to be done, and I'll thank you not to embarrass the girl by pressing it. Good day, ma'am." The other building. And Colonel Matthew Hale, who wanted more than anything in the world to argue who had it all loaded and ready. I've seen her do it. I'd stake my career. She saved a valley, looked at Eliza, and remembered the condition, and closed his mouth. He said nothing. He tipped his hat to the government man, and he turned, and he walked away from the door with Eliza and Jonathan, and he did not say one word in her defense, and it cost him visibly a muscle working in his weathered cheek the whole way down the corridor. "That," he said finally, when they were out of earshot, "was the hardest thing I've done in 30 years of service." "I know," Eliza said. "Thank you." "You're certain?" "I'm certain, Colonel. Let them try it their way first. Let them get 3 days deep into the boundary lines with a man who speaks 2 tongues badly, and then we'll see who comes to the other building." It took less than 3 days. It took a day and a half. Jonathan would remember for the rest of his life the sight of the government man appearing at the door of their lodgings. The same man. The good coat rumpled now, his color high and standing there, working his jaw before he could bring himself to speak. "Mrs. Whitaker." The words came out of him like teeth. There's been a difficulty. The interpreter we have, the Iroquois delegation, has risen twice to leave, and the Spanish are threatening to withdraw over a matter of the fishing rights that I'm told that is we're given to understand may be a question of translation. The Colonel has suggested. He stopped. He could not finish it. "The Colonel suggested you come and ask me," Eliza said. "Yes, to do the thing you told him a woman couldn't do." The man's jaw worked. "Mrs. Whitaker, the fate of the entire northern boundary may turn on the next 2 days, and I find I care a great deal less than I did on Tuesday about who does the interpreting, and a great deal more about whether it's done right. So yes, I'm asking. The government of the United States is asking. Will you come to the table?" Eliza let him stand in it a moment. not cruelly. Just long enough that the asking was real, that it had weight, that it could never afterward be called anything but what it was. "I'll come," she said, "on the condition that when I fix what your man broke, it's written in the record that I fixed it. My name, not an interpreter was found. My name, Colonel Hale, as my witness. If I'm good enough to save your boundary, I'm good enough to be named in the saving of it." "Done," the man said. "God, yes, whatever you like, only come." And she came. She fixed the fishing rights before the noon recess. The man had been translating a word that meant, "We ask to share the waters, as we have no right to these waters," which is a different thing entirely. And the Iroquois had heard themselves being made to renounce a claim they'd never renounced, and had risen twice to leave over it. And Eliza said it right in 4 sentences. And the oldest of the Iroquois delegates looked at her for a long moment, and then spoke to her directly, bypassing the table entirely. And what he said made her go still. What did he say? Jonathan asked her that night at the after, when the shaking came, and he held her hand through it the way he'd sworn to. He said he'd heard from the Wampanoag that there was a woman coming who would not lie. Her voice was unsteady. He said he did not believe it, because he had never met one, not a woman, not a man, not white nor red at a table like this, who would not lie. He said everyone lies at the boundary tables. It's why the boundaries never hold. She pressed her hand flat against her skirt, the old habit stilling the tremor. And then he said today he watched me give his own people back 4 words they'd nearly walked away from, words in his own tongue. And he said, she had to stop. He said perhaps the boundary would hold this time. Perhaps if there was one voice at the table that would not lie, the lines drawn this fall would still be standing when his grandchildren walked them. He said that. To me, a trader's girl they turned away at the door on Tuesday. The conference ran 11 days. By the 4th day, they had stopped seating Eliza at the foot of the interpreter's bench and moved her to the center, where all 4 delegations could see her. By the 6th, the Spanish attaché, who had muttered the ugly thing in Castilian on the first day, came to her privately and apologized in his own language, and she accepted it in his own language, and he went away red and thoughtful. By the 8th day, when a dispute over a river island threatened to collapse the whole eastern half of the boundary, it was Eliza the government men turned to. First, not the man in the good coat, not even the colonel. Eliza, who listened to all 4 sides, and then told the table plainly that they were not arguing about the island at all. They were arguing about who had to cross whose land to reach the island, and that if they'd stop naming the island and start naming the crossing, they'd find they mostly agreed. And they did. And the eastern boundary held, and on the 11th day they signed. 4 nations and 2 crowns, and the government of the United States, and the boundary drawn true. And in the record of it, Jonathan saw it with his own eyes, read it 3 times to be sure. In the formal record of the Northern Boundary Conference written in the government's own hand, it said that the terms had been rendered between the parties by Mrs. Eliza Monroe Whitaker, whose fidelity and skill the commissioners wished particularly to commend. Her name, in the record, where it could never be taken out. She cried when she read it. Not at the table she held it there. She always held it there, the ice her father had mistaken for coldness. She cried that night at the after, with her husband's hand over hers, the way she cried at every after now, because she'd learned at last that the after was a safe place to come apart, so long as there was a hand. My father used to say, she told Jonathan that a woman's name belonged in exactly 2 records, the one that married her and the one that buried her, and that anything else was vanity. She wiped her face. He's been dead 4 years and I still hear him. But tonight there's a 3rd record, Jonathan. A government record. My name in the saving of a boundary that 4 nations couldn't draw without me. And I keep thinking, her voice broke. I keep thinking if he could see it. Not so he'd be proud. He wasn't a man who knew how to be proud of me. Just so he'd know he was wrong. That's all I want. Not his pride. Just for him to know wherever he is that the girl he beat for being right grew up and put her name in a record he said no woman's name belonged in. That she was right the whole time. That being right out loud didn't burn her in the end. It saved a boundary. "He was wrong," Jonathan said. "About that, and about you, and about every single thing that mattered. You've spent 4 years hearing a dead man who was wrong. Maybe it's time to let him finish dying." She looked at him a long moment, and then she laughed wet, surprised real and said, "You've a hard way of putting things, Jonathan Whitaker. I'm a shipping man. We're not poets." "No," she agreed, and leaned into him, spent and safe. "You're not. Thank God. I've had enough pretty words from men who lied. I'll take a plain one from a man who doesn't every day of my life." They went home to the house on the James River when the conference was done. And the house was not the same house because the two people coming back to it were not the two people who had left. Jonathan had a new bedroom made up for her, the best of the good rooms, the one with the morning light and the view of the water. And when he showed it to her, she stood in the door and did not go in. And he understood and did not push and said only, "It's yours when you want it. Or never if you'd rather. I only wanted you to have it to choose." She moved into it a week later. And a month after that, she did not sleep in it alone. But that was her choosing too, in her own time. And it is not a thing that needs telling here, except to say that when a woman who has spent her life being handed across other people's fires finally chooses a door for herself and walks through it on her own feet, it is a kind of victory that does not look like victory from the outside, and is the largest kind there is. The library he gave her outright. He'd meant to make a speech of it. Jonathan was forever meaning to make speeches, now having wasted 3 months making none. But when the moment came, he found he couldn't, so he just put the key in her hand and said, "It was never mine, really. A shipping man doesn't read. It's been waiting 12 years for someone who'd use it. I think it was waiting for you." And she went in, and she ran her hand along the spines, and she found the French priest's kind of Latin, and the Spanish histories, and the accounts of the northern nations, written by men who'd got half of it wrong, and she began quietly to correct them in the margins in her own hand, and Jonathan would find her there at all hours, and it became the truest thing he knew about his own house, that somewhere in it his wife was reading and putting the truth back into books that had got it wrong, the way she'd put the truth back into a treaty, and a boundary, and a marriage. Society did not know what to do with her. That was the comedy of the thing, and Eliza came to enjoy it in her dry way. The same Virginia matrons who had whispered 3 months into her marriage that the Whitaker girl was plain and dull and had nothing to say for herself. Those same matrons now found themselves at dinners where their husbands' fortunes turned on trade agreements and discovered that the plain, dull Whitaker girl was the person their husbands most wanted, seated near the visiting Spanish factor or the French shipping agent or the government man down from Richmond. They mocked her first. Then they needed her. And then, in the particular way of people who have needed someone they once mocked, they decided they had always admired her, and told each other so, and Eliza let them, because she had long ago stopped needing the good opinion of people who gave it only after it was safe. "You could make them grovel," Jonathan observed once watching a matron who'd been especially cruel that first winter now flutter around Eliza at a reception. "The ones who called you dull. You could freeze them out. God knows they've earned it." "I could," Eliza agreed. "Why don't you?" She considered it. "Because I know exactly what it is to be the person everyone's agreed not to see," she said. "And I find I don't want to make anyone else that person, even the ones who made me it. It's a lonely thing, Jonathan. The loneliest thing there is. I wouldn't wish it on my worst matron." She sipped her wine. "Besides, it's a far better revenge to be needed than to be feared. They'll never be free of me now. They'll be inviting me to dinners for the rest of their lives and hating that they have to, and hating worse that they've come to like it. Let them. That's a longer punishment than any freezing out, and I don't have to lift a finger." Jonathan laughed. "You are," he said, "the most dangerous woman in Virginia." "I'm the most honest woman in Virginia," she corrected. "It only looks dangerous to people who've built their lives on the other thing." Word came that autumn that Silas Boone had died in the county jail, awaiting his transport of a fever quietly, the way he'd done most things. and that Calder had been sentenced, and had, true to the confession Eliza had wrung out of him, with nothing but a choice, named himself the author of the whole scheme, and shielded the 10 guilty men who were fined and sworn and frightened into a decade of honesty, and the 3 forged men who woke one morning to learn how close they'd come to a ruin they never knew about, and went pale and went home and were never told the whole of it. Calder took the weight alone. He'd chosen the other way at the end, the way Eliza had asked him to, the way she'd spent her whole life wishing she'd once seen a cornered man choose. "You did that," Jonathan told her when the word came. "He fell alone because you gave him away to. 12 men are still standing who wouldn't be." "He did it," Eliza said. "I only opened the door. A man still has to walk through it himself. That's the one thing I learned that my father never did. You can't make anyone honest. You can only make honesty possible, and then stand back and let them choose and be there for whatever comes after." She was quiet a moment. "It's most of what I do at the tables when it comes down to it. I don't make men tell the truth. I just make it so the truth has a door to come through, and then I hold it open and I wait." Chief Gray Elk sent word in the spring. His people had walked the boundary lines drawn at the Northern Conference all the way from the eastern rivers to the western ridges, and the lines had held through the winter, and no wagon had crossed the sleeping camps with guns after dark, and no dispute at any ford had been settled by soldiers. And for the first time in living memory, a whole cold season had passed on that frontier without a killing. And Gray Elk sent with the word a gift, a length of worked deerskin painted, and Eliza wept when she saw it, because she could read what was painted on it, and Jonathan could not. "It's a name," she told him. "In their way of writing names. It's the name they gave me when I was 11, and corrected the lie, and got struck for it. The child who would not lie." She traced it with her finger. "But he's changed it. Gray Elk. He's added to it. It says now." Her voice failed, and she gathered it and finished. "It says the woman whose word holds the boundary. He's given me a grown woman's name to replace the child's. He's telling me the child lived, that she made it all the way to being the woman, and the woman does what the child only dreamed of doing, that the boundary holds because of her word." She pressed the deerskin to her chest. "No one ever gave me a grown-up name before, Jonathan. I've been a child who wouldn't lie my whole life, frozen at 11 years old at the one moment I was brave. And a Wampanoag chief looked at me across 2 treaty tables and decided it was time I grew up, and gave me the name to do it in." Jonathan Whitaker looked at his wife holding the painted skin against her heart, and he thought about the woman who had come into his house 3 months a burden, and a year later held 4 nations' peace in her mouth, and he thought about all the men who had spent her life deciding what she was. Her father with his hand, the cousin with his arrangement, Boone with his sneer, Calder with his gun, the government man with his good coat and his other building, every one of them so certain they knew what a quiet woman was worth. And he thought about how every last one of them had been wrong, and how the being wrong had cost some of them everything, and how the only man who'd come out of it with anything worth having was the one who'd been fool enough and lucky enough to finally ask. He had asked her 10,000 questions since. He'd kept that promise past all reckoning. And he meant to ask her 10,000 more before he was through, because he'd discovered the thing her father never had, and Boone never had, and Calder never had the thing that was worth more than all the tongues and all the treaties, that at the bottom of Eliza Monroe Whitaker, there was no bottom that a man could go on asking her his whole life, and never once reach the end of what was in her, and that a marriage built on that kind of asking did not wear out the way other marriages did, but deepened year on year, the way a river deepens the channel it's already cut. "Come here," he said. She came. She always came now, to the after and to the before, and to all the ordinary middle hours that were neither, because she'd learned at last that in this one house, with this one man coming when called, did not mean being owned. It meant being wanted. She'd spent 30 years unable to tell the difference. She could tell it now. "They sent you to my house as a burden," Jonathan said, holding her the deerskin pressed between them with its grown woman's name. "A plain wife to clear a family debt. A silent thing to sit at the foot of my table and never trouble me. That's what they sent. That's what I thought I'd got." His arms tightened. And when the most powerful men in the Commonwealth lost their words, when a valley was one lie from burning, and a boundary 4 nations couldn't draw, and a room full of proud men had argued themselves to the edge of a war, every single time it was the burden they sent me, who turned out to be the only voice in the country strong enough to save them all. Eliza Whittaker lifted her head from her husband's chest and looked up at him with dry eyes and a steady mouth and a name painted on deerskin over her heart that said she had grown all the way up at last. And she did not lower her gaze, the way she'd lowered it every day of the first 30 years of her life, because she had finally learned in this house, from this man at 10,000 askings and 100 afters, that her eyes belonged wherever she chose to rest them, and that no one living would ever again teach her otherwise. "Then it's a good thing," she said, "that you finally learned to ask."